I rescued a woman who had suffered cardiac arrhythmia, but I arrived too late and lost my job. But when I returned to the office the next day to collect my things, I saw her. Mark Johnson was just trying to survive another chaotic day in Boston when an unexpected choice put him on an irreversible path. In a matter of minutes, his world turned upside down. He saved a life but lost everything he had built. Now, Mark must face the consequences of his decisions and navigate a universe of power, morality, and new opportunities. How will he deal with the weight of his choices? And what impact will this have on his life and his family? Prepare for a journey of tension, discovery, and transformation. The persistent sound of the alarm clock echoed through Mark Johnson's small apartment in Boston. He woke up suddenly, feeling a pang of anxiety in his chest as he realized he was late. It was an important day at the office, and the last thing he could afford was to be late. The work at the company had become more demanding, and Mark knew he was walking a fine line, trying to balance professional demands with family responsibilities. In recent months, he had realized how much he was sacrificing his personal life for the sake of work. Quickly, he got dressed, barely had time to adjust his tie, and rushed out into the bustling streets of the city, where Boston's frenetic pace seemed to be in sync with his haste. The sun was just rising, casting golden rays over the red brick buildings, but Mark had no time to appreciate the beauty of the morning. Every minute counted, and he knew that if he wanted to keep his job, he needed to make it in time for the morning meeting with Mrs. Williams, his boss, who was not known for her patience. The image of her severe expression and disapproving gaze haunted him as he quickened his pace. On his way, Mark passed by people starting their daily routines. Parents taking their children to school, workers in a hurry like him, and the continuous movement of a city that never stopped. Despite all these thoughts running through his mind, the routine pushed him into his usual coffee shop. He was already known there, and the barista, without needing instructions, started preparing Mark's black coffee. However, as he waited, with his eyes fixed on the clock, Mark noticed something strange happening outside the cafe. A woman, apparently in her 50s, was leaning against a pole, pale, with an expression of pain on her face. She was trying to breathe, but it seemed like the air wasn't reaching her lungs. Mark felt a chill down his spine. Something was very wrong. He hesitated for a second, torn between the urgency of getting to work and the feeling that he couldn't just ignore what he was seeing. For a moment, his mind filled with doubts. What if this delays me even more? What if Mrs. Williams doesn't accept my excuse? But what tormented him the most was the possibility of doing nothing and this woman dying because of it. The coffee was ready, but instead of grabbing it, Mark ran out the door, heading towards the woman in distress. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. The woman tried to respond, but her voice failed. She clung to Mark's arm, almost collapsing. He quickly realized the seriousness of the situation. The woman was struggling to breathe, and her skin was turning a bluish color, indicating a severe cardiac arrhythmia. Mark wasn't a doctor, but he had heard about symptoms like these and knew that every second was crucial. Without thinking twice, he grabbed his phone and called 911, describing the situation as clearly as possible. The response was quick. An ambulance was on its way. Meanwhile, Mark helped the woman sit down on the ground, trying to keep her conscious. "Stay with me, okay?" he said, holding the woman's trembling hand. "Help is on the way. Just breathe, slowly." Minutes felt like hours, but soon the paramedics arrived, taking control of the situation. They quickly diagnosed the cardiac arrhythmia and began administering first aid. Mark watched everything, feeling helpless but knowing he had done the right thing. He answered some questions from the paramedics, providing details about what had happened before the ambulance left, taking the woman to the nearest hospital. With his heart still racing, Mark looked at the clock. He was officially late for work. Mrs. Williams would not be pleased with this, but as he watched the ambulance drive away, he knew he had made the right choice. The life of that woman was more important than any meeting. Even so, the anxiety returned as he began walking toward the office. How would he explain his lateness? Would Mrs. Williams understand? He wasn't sure, but he would only find out by facing whatever came next. Mark Johnson, still shaken by what had just happened, walked toward the office with heavy steps. The streets of Boston, usually full of hurried people, seemed especially chaotic on that challenging day. The sound of cars and the hum of conversations around him only increased his anxiety. He tried to organize his thoughts, but the image of the woman in distress wouldn't leave his mind. The feeling of having done something important was battling with the fear of the consequences he would face at work. Finally, he spotted the building where he worked. It was a tall, imposing structure with mirrored glass reflecting the city. The entrance seemed like an open mouth, ready to swallow him along with his worries. He stopped for a moment, took a deep breath, and decided that the only thing he could do was be honest. Maybe, just maybe, Mrs. Williams would understand. However, at the same time, he knew her patience was running out. In recent months, Mark had been late more times than he would like to admit, always for reasons that seemed justifiable at the time but were never well received by his boss. Upon entering, Mark headed straight for the elevator, pressing the button repeatedly as if that could make it arrive faster. The doors opened, and he stepped in, feeling his stomach churn as the elevator ascended. The words he would use to explain his lateness kept repeating in his mind, but none seemed adequate. The truth was simple, but he feared it wouldn't be enough. "I helped someone in distress," he kept repeating to himself, trying to believe that Mrs. Williams would understand. But he knew that the corporate environment didn't always value such actions. Punctuality and efficiency were the pillars that supported his career, and he was failing in both. The floor of his office was quiet, except for the distant sound of keyboards and phones. As he approached Mrs. Williams' office, he noticed that the door was ajar, which was unusual. She usually kept it closed, a clear signal that her authority should not be questioned. Mark hesitated for a moment before knocking lightly and pushing the door open. "Come in," said Mrs. Williams' cold, controlled voice. She was sitting behind her desk, glasses perched on the tip of her nose, reviewing some documents. She didn't lift her eyes when Mark entered, which only increased his nervousness. The office was impeccably tidy, with stacks of papers organized and everything in its place, reflecting the meticulous personality of his boss. Mark knew that Mrs. Williams did not tolerate disorder, and what was about to happen was, for her, a break in order. "Mrs. Williams, I'm sorry for being late. Something happened on the way to work. A woman. She was in trouble. I had to help her. I called an ambulance and..." Before he could finish, she raised her hand, signaling him to stop talking. Finally, her eyes lifted, fixing on his with a look that seemed to freeze the air around them. "Mark, do you realize how many times this has happened?" she said, her voice cutting. "Late arrivals, justifications, and now another excuse. It doesn't matter what happened out there. Here, what counts is your commitment to work. And unfortunately, that seems to be lacking." Mark opened his mouth to protest, but the words died in his throat. He knew that arguing would be futile. Mrs. Williams was inflexible when it came to punctuality and dedication. He could see the verdict in her eyes even before she spoke the words. "You're fired, Mark. Pack your things and leave the office immediately." The impact of those words was like a punch to the stomach. The room seemed to spin, and for a moment, Mark couldn't react. His mind clung to what had happened that morning. He knew he had done the right thing, but here, in front of his boss, it seemed irrelevant. The environment, once so familiar, now felt hostile and oppressive. He had always known that the company valued results more than people, but hearing those words made that reality hit painfully hard. Without saying anything more, Mark turned and left the room. Each step felt heavier than the last. He passed by his colleagues, some casting curious glances, others indifferent. No one knew what had just happened, and he didn't have the strength to explain. The thought of going home and facing Emily made him even more anxious. How would he explain this to her? And to Hannah? The worry about providing for his family began to mix with the shame and sense of failure. As he headed to his desk to pack his things, Mark's mind returned to the woman he had helped. Amidst his misfortune, the only thing that comforted him was the certainty that, at least, he had done something good on that challenging day. Still, that didn't make the loss of his job any less painful. What would become of him now? And of his family? Those questions swirled in his mind as he left the building, feeling more lost than ever. Mark Johnson left the building where he had worked for the past 5 years with a sense of emptiness. The challenging day that had begun with a noble decision now seemed to be dragging him into a tide of uncertainties. The Boston sun was higher, and the heat was beginning to rise from the sidewalks, but Mark barely felt it. His mind was in turmoil, replaying the scene at the office over and over, searching for a way to justify what had happened. He knew he had done the right thing, but the cost of that decision was higher than he had imagined. As he wandered aimlessly through the city streets, his mind drifted. He thought about Emily and Hannah, and the weight of responsibility on his shoulders seemed to grow with each step. Emily had held things together during difficult times, always understanding and ready to support, but Mark knew that their financial situation didn't allow for many mistakes. He couldn't help but wonder how she would react to the news of his dismissal. How would he explain that he had lost his job because of something that, to him, was a moral imperative? And how would they deal with the financial consequences? Mark knew he needed to tell his wife, Emily, what had happened. The thought of facing her worried expression and seeing the hope fade from her eyes made his stomach churn. Emily was understanding and loving, but their financial reality didn't allow for many errors. With a young daughter and a mortgage, losing his job was a heavy blow. What am I going to say to her? Mark thought, running his hands through his hair, feeling cold sweat on his forehead. He knew Emily deserved the truth, but he feared her reaction, not because she wouldn't understand, but because he felt he had let her down. When he finally reached the small apartment he shared with Emily and their daughter, Hannah, he paused in front of the door for a few moments, taking deep breaths. He wanted to have something positive to say, but the only thing he could think of was the sense of defeat. With trembling hands, he turned the doorknob and entered. The familiar sound of Hannah's laughter welcomed him, but instead of bringing comfort, it made his chest ache even more. He had failed, and the weight of it seemed unbearable. Mark! Emily's voice echoed through the room as soon as the door opened. She was in the kitchen, preparing lunch, and when she saw him, she dried her hands on the apron and approached. The smile on her face disappeared as soon as she noticed Mark's downcast expression. There was something in his eyes that made her stop smiling, as if she sensed that something was terribly wrong. "What happened?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. Mark tried to smile, but it was in vain. He approached Emily, holding her hands. "Emily, I lost my job." The impact of those words was clear on her face. Her eyes widened for a second, and she brought one hand to her mouth as if trying to hold back the questions flooding her mind. Mark waited for what seemed like an eternity for a response. Anything that would indicate how she was processing the news. "How? What happened?" she finally asked, her voice breaking with surprise. Mark explained everything, from the moment he saw the woman in distress to the fateful meeting with Mrs. Williams. As he spoke, he saw the mix of emotions on Emily's face. Concern, sadness, but also an understanding that touched him deeply. She listened attentively, without interrupting, just absorbing every word. When he finished, the silence stretched for a few moments until Emily finally spoke. "You did the right thing, Mark." Her voice was soft but firm. "I know it's hard now, but you couldn't just ignore that woman." He nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. Knowing that Emily supported him was a relief, but the weight of responsibility didn't lessen. Without a job and without income, He knew the coming weeks would be challenging. Even with Emily's support, the uncertainty about the future still loomed over him. How could he ensure he made the right choices going forward? In the days that followed, Mark found himself trapped in a routine of uncertainty. He spent hours sending out resumes, but the responses were few and unpromising. Meanwhile, his mind frequently wandered back to the woman he had helped. He wondered if she was okay, if she had managed to recover. There was something about her, a fragility that touched him, and it motivated him to visit the hospital to see her. Perhaps seeing that she was okay would help ease the guilt he still felt for losing his job. The hospital was a place he would normally avoid, but that week, it became his refuge. The presence of the woman he had rescued, now identified as Rebecca Carter, brought a sense of purpose. Each visit was a reminder that, even amidst the chaos of his own life, he had done something good. He wasn't entirely sure why he kept returning. Maybe to see if she was recovering, or perhaps because seeing someone get better helped him cope with his own situation. But despite finding some solace in the visits, the harsh reality of life continued to press on him. The money was running out, and the lack of responses from employers left him increasingly anxious. Mark knew he needed to find a solution quickly, but the options seemed limited. He was caught between the moral duty that had led him here and the desperate need to support his family. The tensions within him continued to grow, and Mark knew that sooner or later, he would have to make a decision that could change the course of his life. The days passed slowly for Mark Johnson, each one bringing a new layer of tension and uncertainty. The routine of sending out resumes, receiving few responses, and facing growing anxiety was becoming exhausting. Emily did her best to keep things calm at home, but Mark knew that the weight of the situation was affecting all of them, including their daughter, Hannah, who was beginning to sense the tense atmosphere. Despite the challenges, Mark continued visiting Rebecca Carter at the hospital. He wasn't exactly sure why he felt the need, but those visits had become a sort of anchor amidst the chaos. With each meeting, he saw Rebecca's gradual improvement, and with it, he felt a small spark of hope within himself. There was something deeply human about witnessing the recovery of someone he had helped, as if the good he had done could somehow return to him in another form. Rebecca was sitting up in bed, looking out the window. When she heard the door open, she turned slowly, and upon seeing Mark, a smile formed on her face. It was a smile of gratitude, but also of something more, something that Mark still couldn't define. There was a connection that had formed between them, a bond that went beyond mere gratitude. "Mark, I don't know how to thank you for what you did for me." Rebecca's voice trembled slightly, revealing the emotion she was trying to control. "I've heard what happened to you, how you lost your job because of what you did for me. That touches me in a way I can't describe." Mark lowered his eyes, feeling the embarrassment grow. He didn't want her to feel guilty. He had done what he felt was right, but the consequences had been harsh. "Rebecca, it's not your fault." He looked at her, trying to be sincere. "I did what I had to do. Yes, things have gotten difficult, but I don't regret helping you." Rebecca continued to watch him, and for a moment, the silence between them seemed to stretch, full of unspoken meanings. Mark was about to change the subject, but before he could, Rebecca took a deep breath and began to speak again, this time with more firmness. "I need to tell you something, Mark. I don't think you know who I am. My full name is Rebecca Carter, and I'm the CEO of Carter Industries." Mark blinked, absorbing the information. The name sounded familiar, but he didn't know exactly why. As reality began to form in his mind, he felt his stomach turn. Carter Industries was one of the largest technology companies in Boston, known for its influence and power in the market. He had always imagined that the executives of these large corporations were unattainable, almost like distant figures on a pedestal. And now, he was sitting next to one of those figures, someone he had helped without having any idea of her identity. "I didn't know," he said, somewhat stunned. "I had no idea who you were." Rebecca smiled again, this time with a touch of sadness. "I don't make a point of advertising who I am, especially in moments of vulnerability. But now I think it's important for you to know." She paused, seeming to carefully consider her next words. "Mark, what you did for me is priceless. You risked your life and your job for a stranger. I can't let that go unnoticed." Mark felt the air become denser, as if something big was about to happen, something he couldn't foresee. He watched Rebecca with a mix of anticipation and apprehension, not knowing exactly what she was about to say. "I want to offer you a position in my company," Rebecca continued, firmly. "I'm not just talking about any job. I want you to work directly with me as my personal assistant. We need people like you who understand the value of human life and who don't hesitate to do what's right, even when it costs dearly." Mark didn't know what to say. He felt grateful, confused, and emotional all at once. The opportunity was a chance at redemption, a new beginning that he had never imagined. But he knew that the decision couldn't be made without considering all aspects of his life. "I appreciate it, Rebecca. I really do. I'll think about it and get back to you soon." The words came out with difficulty as he tried to control the avalanche of emotions that were unfolding inside him. Rebecca nodded, understanding. "That's all I ask. And remember, Mark, what you did was not in vain. Sometimes the best opportunities come from the most difficult decisions." Mark said goodbye to Rebecca with a handshake, feeling that this simple gesture sealed something important, something that would change his life forever. He knew that as he left that hospital room, he wouldn't be the same. Rebecca's offer was a chance to start over, to rewrite his story, but also to face new challenges that he couldn't yet imagine. Mark Johnson walked through the streets of Boston as if he were in a trance, still absorbing Rebecca Carter's words. The unexpected offer echoed in his mind, opening up a range of possibilities that he had never imagined. The city around him seemed the same as always, but for Mark, everything had changed. He was now faced with a choice that could alter the course of his life and his family's life forever. As he walked, Mark reflected on the past few weeks and how his life had transformed since that fateful day when he helped Rebecca. He thought about Emily, how she had always been by his side, supporting him even in the most difficult moments. Now, more than ever, he knew he would need her support to make the right decision. Rebecca's offer was a unique opportunity, but it involved great risk. Mark knew that working directly with someone as powerful and influential as Rebecca could change his life in ways he didn't yet fully understand. When he arrived home that night, Emily immediately noticed that something had changed in her husband. There was a different gleam in his eyes, a tension mixed with excitement. She was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when he entered. Seeing him, she put down what she was doing and walked over, drying her hands on her apron. Mark approached her, holding her hands with a delicacy that contrasted with the inner turmoil he was feeling. He knew he needed to share with her what had happened, but the words seemed stuck. There was so much at stake, and he feared that by verbalizing his thoughts, things would become even more real. "Emily, I need to tell you something," he said, feeling the weight of responsibility in every word. "Today, when I went to the hospital, something happened. Something big." Emily frowned, worried. "What is it, Mark? You're scaring me." He led her to the living room and sat down beside her on the sofa. There was a nervousness he couldn't hide, but also a determination that was beginning to solidify. As they settled in, Mark felt the weight of the decision he was about to share. He knew he couldn't make this decision alone. "Rebecca Carter, the woman I helped..." He paused, still processing the enormity of the situation. "She's the CEO of Carter Industries, one of the largest technology companies in Boston." Emily's eyes widened in surprise. She had heard of Carter Industries, as practically everyone in Boston had. It was a company known for its innovation and its influence in the market. The news left her momentarily speechless. She tried to imagine what this meant, but the revelation seemed surreal. "Mark, that's incredible. But do you want this job?" she asked, her voice full of uncertainty. Mark took a deep breath, letting her question echo in his mind. The truth was, he still didn't know the answer. Rebecca's offer was a unique opportunity, almost like a second chance to start over, but it involved entering a world he didn't know. A world of high pressure, high expectations, and possibly great responsibilities that could change the dynamic of his family life. In the days that followed, Mark couldn't stop thinking about Rebecca's offer. He talked with Emily repeatedly, weighing the pros and cons, while also reflecting on how this choice would affect their daughter, Hannah. It was a period of uncertainty, but also of self-discovery. Mark began to realize that the help he had offered Rebecca on that challenging day had not just been an act of kindness. It had been a reflection of who he truly was, someone who valued human life above all else, even at the cost of his own well-being. It was with this renewed conviction that, after several days of reflection, Mark decided to call Rebecca. He knew he was about to step into uncharted territory, but something inside him said that this was the right thing to do. He felt that this was the opportunity that could transform his life, not just professionally, but on a deeper, more personal level. Mark was ready to face the challenge, but he knew he needed to keep his integrity and values intact along the way. Rebecca, I thought a lot about your offer, and I'd like to accept it, Mark replied, feeling a mix of relief and nervousness. The decision was made, but he knew the real test was about to begin. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line before Rebecca responded with a voice full of satisfaction. You won't regret it, Mark. I know that together we can do incredible things. Welcome to Carter Industries. As he hung up the phone, Mark felt a wave of emotions wash over him. The decision was made, and now he was about to embark on a new phase of his life. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to face the challenges ahead. As he turned to Emily, who was watching him anxiously, Mark smiled. There was a new confidence in his eyes, a certainty that no matter what came next, he wouldn't be facing it alone. Let's start this new chapter together, he said, embracing her tightly. Emily returned the embrace, feeling that despite all the challenges, they were ready for whatever came next. Mark Johnson's first days at Carter Industries felt like diving into unknown waters. Everything there was new to him, the people, the responsibilities, the fast pace, and most of all, the constant proximity to Rebecca Carter. She, who had once been just a distant figure, had now become a central part of his professional life. The environment was challenging, and Mark quickly realized that working alongside Rebecca required more than he had imagined. The pressure was constant, decisions were made at a rapid pace, and challenges seemed to arise from all sides. However, there was something within him, something that awakened with each new challenge. A part of himself that he had forgotten, or perhaps never fully known, began to emerge. Mark had always been dedicated and hardworking, but now he was in a position that demanded more than that. It required leadership, strategic vision, and, above all, courage to make difficult decisions. Over the days, he began to realize that this was the opportunity he had always sought but never knew he needed. As Mark adapted to the new job, he and Rebecca began to develop a relationship that went beyond the professional. The mutual respect they had established at the hospital transformed into a solid friendship, and over time, that friendship began to deepen in unexpected ways. There was a connection forming between them, an understanding that didn't need words. Emily noticed the changes in Mark. He was more confident, more self-assured, and despite the fatigue that often accompanied him at the end of the day, there was a sparkle in his eyes that she hadn't seen in a long time. They frequently talked about work, about the challenges and achievements, and Emily was impressed by how Mark was handling everything. Even so, she couldn't help but notice how much Rebecca was beginning to be part of those conversations. One night, after putting Hannah to bed, Emily and Mark sat on the couch, as they usually did. But there was something in the air, something unsaid that hung between them. Emily, with her usual sensitivity, sensed that it was time to bring up what she was feeling. Mark, "I'm so proud of you, of how you're handling all this," she began, her voice soft. "But I need to ask, how do you feel about Rebecca?" Mark turned to her, surprised by the question, but at the same time, knowing it was a question he had avoided confronting. There was a truth in her words, something he had been feeling but hadn't yet had the courage to fully admit. "Emily, he hesitated, searching for the right words. "I respect Rebecca a lot. She gave me a chance when I needed it most. And yes, we've become close. But you're my wife. Nothing is more important to me than you and our family." Emily looked into Mark's eyes, trying to read beyond the words. There was sincerity in what he said, but she also sensed the complexity of the situation. What she saw in Mark wasn't just gratitude for Rebecca, but a deep admiration, something that went beyond the professional. "I know, Mark, and I know you're a man of integrity, but I just want you to be sure of your feelings so that we can face this together, as we always have." Mark nodded, feeling the weight of Emily's words. She had always been his rock, his confidant, and now, more than ever, he needed her wisdom. He knew that the path he was treading was full of challenges, not just professional, but also emotional. He needed to keep his moral compass aligned, not just for success at work, but to ensure that his family remained his safe haven. In the days that followed, Mark deeply reflected on his relationship with Rebecca. He couldn't deny the connection he felt, but he also knew that this connection didn't diminish his love for Emily. The complexity of human emotions had never been clearer to him. He could love his wife and, at the same time, feel deep admiration for another person. But he knew he needed to set clear boundaries, both to protect his family and to maintain his integrity. One morning, after a difficult meeting, Rebecca asked to speak with Mark in private. They went to her office, where the tension seemed to hang in the air. She closed the door and turned to him, with a look Mark had never seen before. "Mark, I need to talk to you about something important," Rebecca said, her voice serious. "I really value what we have, our friendship and how well we work together. But I also feel that sometimes our personal and professional lines blur. I want to be honest with you because I have a lot of respect for what you have at home, with your wife and daughter." Mark felt his stomach tighten. He knew this conversation was necessary, but that didn't make it any less uncomfortable. "Rebecca, I appreciate your honesty, and I agree with you. I've thought a lot about this, and I want you to know that for me, my family is the most important thing. Our professional relationship is valuable, but I can't let it interfere with my personal life." Rebecca smiled softly, a smile that showed understanding and perhaps even relief. "I really admire that about you, Mark. I think that's why I trust you so much. I want us to continue working together, but with the clarity that our priorities are different, and that's okay." Mark felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The conversation wasn't easy, but it was necessary. He knew that now, more than ever, he needed to be clear about where his heart lay. The following months brought new challenges and achievements for Mark and Rebecca at Carter Industries. But at the same time, Mark also made sure that his time and energy were properly balanced between work and his family life. He continued to grow professionally, learning more about himself and what really mattered. By the end of the year, Mark looked back and saw how much he had changed. He had faced difficulties, unexpected challenges, and twists that could have destabilized anyone. But he stood tall, stronger, and more aware of his own abilities and limitations. He knew that life wasn't just about professional success, but also about maintaining the human connections that truly matter. Mark had found a new purpose in his life and knew that, regardless of future challenges, he had the strength and support needed to face them.